Welcome to February's Mike's Podcast Club. We are a community of podcasters from across the world, and our main aim is just to help people or help each other make absolutely brilliant podcasts. So there's about just over 1,000 of us from across the world, part of Mike's Podcast Club, and we meet every month online as part of a support group for podcasters, where we come and arm ourselves with questions we've got about podcasting. Your boss has just turned up, Sarah. Questions we've got about podcasting, making podcasts, and as a collective of awesome podcasters, we help each other solve those problems. And every so often, we invite a special guest to do a special talk on something related to podcasting. So that is what we're doing tonight. And for this first half of Podcast Club, so from now until 7 o'clock, we've got our very first special guest of 2023, Sarah McDowell from the awesome Captivate podcast hosting service. And she's their SEO manager. And after 7, it's our Ask Us Anything, Mike's Podcast Club, where you can ask us anything about podcasting or answer anything about podcasting, or just sit back and soak up all of that lovely knowledge. A reminder that Mike's Podcast Club is free to come along to. We've got a Facebook group that we put stuff in between meetups, but it's not free to put on. So if you'd like to donate just £4 to help us continue to run Mike's Podcast Club and provide services for lovely podcasters from across the world, then do feel free to donate via our Buy Me a Coffee page, and that is in the link in the chat now. all of that. So you can also follow us online. We're at Mike's Podcast Club on Twitter, and you can use the hashtag Mike's Podcast Club to tell people that you're here. And just an FYI, if you've joined now, we are recording tonight's session for the first half. So we'll be recording this, and you'll be able to watch it again in a few weeks' time on our YouTube channel, where all the other chats or other specialized chats are there as well. And a note about the chat as well. Some lovely stuff happens in there. People share advice and comments and pure bants. I'll never say that ever again in my life. But also the chat is a space where you can ask your questions as well. So as Sarah's talking and telling us all these gorgeous tips about SEO, if you've got a burning question that you'd like to ask her, pop it in chat. And so we know it's to Sarah, use the prefix, put hashtag Sarah, and then your question, just as my glamorous assistant has just done in chat there as an example. And what we'll do is we'll take that question, we'll save it, and we'll ask Sarah at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sarah McDowell from Captivate to talk about how you can boost your discoverability on search and on podcast apps through your podcast. Thank you, Sarah.
Hello, everyone. So yes, very excited to be here. So let me just get myself set up. So I'll just share my screen. And if someone could just let me know that they can see my slides, okay? Yeah.
All good.
Yeah, is that good?
Yep.
Wonderful. Right, so yes, very excited to be here and to talk to you all about how you can boost your podcast discoverability with SEO. So thank you very much to Vic and Charles for inviting me along. Very honoured. And yes, let's get nerding out about podcasts and SEO. So first things first, who am I? So hopefully there are some Wrong Burgundy fans in the room. But yeah, why should you trust what I'm saying? So I'm a podcaster. So I've been podcasting since 2018. Just launched my 4th podcast. So caught the bug, really love podcasting, love the industry. I've also been working in SEO for over 10 years. Wow, that's a long time if you think about it. And I love SEO as well. Working at Captivate, so those who don't know who we are, who Captivate is, we are a podcast hosting and management platform. We do so much for podcasters, so check us out. But yeah, I feel that working at Captivate, I get to combine two of my passions, which is podcasts and SEO. So having a whale of a time, really. Possibly the most important question. Okay, so what will you learn? What will you take away after this session with me? So you will have an understanding of what podcast SEO is, why it's so important, and how it can help with your discoverability of your podcast. And because I'm feeling extra generous and extra nice tonight, I'm going to be giving you actionable podcast SEO techniques that you can take away and implement right after the talk if you're that eager to. So yes, let's begin. So I just want to start by talking about podcast discoverability. So obviously, there's lots of ways that people can come across your podcast. So for the traditionalists out there, they might head on over to their favorite app. So maybe that's Spotify, Amazon Music, insert your choice, your app of choice. So they could find you when they're searching in there. Search engines, okay, so search engines like Google, Bing. Now, just as a heads up, I'm going to be focusing on Google in this talk, and that is because Google has the highest market share. So most people use Google, and what tends to work in Google can sort of work in other search engines. Now, obviously, a bit of a caveat because all search engines are different, that they work differently. But yes, we're going to be focusing on Google tonight. And because I'm so professional, other stuffs, right? So there's other ways that people can come across your podcast as well. They might find you on a newsletter. You might appear on someone else's podcast. Again, for the traditionalists, you might be out networking and you're chatting to people and you get to tell them about your podcast. So yeah, there's lots of different ways that people can come across your podcast. So when we think about podcast discoverability, that's a hard word to say. It's not just about apps, but what this talk is going to focus on is Google. Okay, so let's get on with it then. Increase visibility with SEO. So just want to start with a bit of a reminder because aware that there might be some people who aren't aware of what SEO is. So it stands for Search Engine Optimisation, and in its simplest terms, I just hit my microphone there, that passionate. In the simplest terms, it is the process of improving your website to increase its visibility when people search for relevant queries, products or services related to what you do as a business in Google and other search engines. What is podcast SEO then? So podcast SEO is similar. So podcast SEO is where you do tactics or you implement techniques to your podcast so that when someone is searching in Google, they come across your podcast. Because when someone is searching in Google, Google can show you. So yeah, podcast SEO is that basically. So boosting that discoverability, in boosting the chances of people coming across you when they search for relevant queries in Google. Now, just want to paint a bit of a picture. I'm going to share some stats and prove to you how important podcast SEO is. So if you all look at where my big pink arrow is pointing to, and in Google, on average, every month globally, there are around 83,000 searches for podcasts, okay? So if you look at the top left, you'll see that it says best podcast. So all these queries could include best SEO podcast, best comedy podcast, best health and fitness podcast, okay? So this goes to show that people are going to Google to find podcasts, to find you, right? So if you are serious about your audience growth and your podcast growth, you need to have SEO as part of your strategy. So how does it look then? So how does Google show podcasts? So you already know that I'm a bit of a nerd. So earlier I was searching for SEO podcasts, and this is what is shown to us on a desktop. So at the top there, we have our ads. So this is how Google makes money. So they're always going to have this. But just underneath, we have a grid. Now I'm going to teach you your first bit of SEO lingo. And we would call that a featured snippet, okay? So within this featured snippet, within this grid, we have a selection of different SEO podcasts. We can see their artwork, we can see the title of the podcast, and there's a drop down. And when we hit that drop down, we get more information about the podcast, and we see where that podcast has been mentioned. So that's on desktop. Slightly different when we are looking on a mobile. So on mobile, we have that similar grid, but obviously because it's on a smaller screen, it's more in a list format, but you've still got your drop downs. But what's really cool, if you're on a mobile, Google can show a podcast episode carousel, right? So here for SEO podcasts, I'm being shown Edge of the Web, Crawling Mondays, and other podcast episodes that are relevant to that search term, SEO podcast. And what happens when we click one? So we click Edge of the Web, and Google have their own podcast playing platform. And so people are taken when they're on mobile, when they are on mobile to that episode within Google Podcasts, we get more information and we can hit play. Right. So we now know what podcast SEO is. We now know why it's important and how it can increase visibility. Okay. So let's get to the juicy part of my talk, right? Let me share with you now 6 ways to increase visibility with SEO. So hopefully you've got, there was a lot of chat about notebooks earlier, so hopefully we've got them at the ready. So yeah, let's delve into number 1, which is a website, okay? So it is so important that podcasts have websites. So I just want to start off by pointing out a quote that Google themselves said in 2021. Linking your podcast to a homepage will help the discovery and presentation of your podcast on Google services. Now, you might be thinking, yes, Sarah, but we're talking about podcasts. Yes, we are, but we're talking about people coming across your podcasts in Google, and Google deals with web pages, right? So if you have a website for your podcast, you are giving Google web pages to show people when people are searching for relevant terms in its search engine, right? So we need to have a website. It is so important. And I just want to show some other reasons why it's important. So this is what happens when you search for the SERPs Up podcast. Now, the SERPs Up podcast is a podcast done by Wix. And as you can see at the top there, what Google is showing is a website. Okay, so Wix have a page on their website about the podcast. So that's great because we've already got that. We can already take that traffic, get people from Google that way. Now, if you look to where my pink arrow is pointing and you see this box, are you ready for your second bit of lingo? You're going to sound like such an SEO professional at the end of this. But this is what we call a knowledge panel, right? So Google has created a knowledge panel about the SERPs Up podcast. Now, how did they do this? So obviously, you've probably seen lots of different knowledge panels, and Google can create knowledge panels for famous people, brands, companies. Basically, it can create knowledge panels if it has enough information and enough context, because it sees, like, so for the SERPs Up podcast, it sees that as an entity, okay? And so for it to put together this knowledge panel, it needs to understand as much as it can about that entity, about that podcast, right? So one way that you can do that is by having a website, right? Because Google can link that website to your podcast, and you've got all this great information on that website as well. So it's a great way to help you in this journey with getting a knowledge panel. And it also gives Google the opportunity to surface individual podcast episodes. So here is the SEO mindset. So with my podcast website, each of my episodes have individual pages, and I recommend everyone does this because, again, you are increasing the visibility, you're increasing what Google can show people when they're searching in Google. So if someone searches for a relevant query, so obviously I am here, I'm interviewing Brenda Malone about avoiding burnout. So when people are searching for relevant terms, so maybe that's like an SEO podcast about burnout, for example, obviously people can search in lots of different ways. But again, if you have a website and you have individual pages for your episodes, you're increasing that discoverability. You're giving Google more things to show to people when they're searching for relevant stuff. Now, those who are worried about having to put a website together, because I understand that some of you might already have a website, you're already sorted, or you've got a website that you can add a podcast page to. For those that are worried about another thing to have to do, just want to show you my website. So this is the SEO Mindset podcast. And here we've got all the latest episodes, and then we can click into an individual episode and it takes us to that episode. We can play with the web player, got all my show notes, all my information, my transcript about the podcast, the hosts, okay? Now, I managed to do this from within Captivate's dashboard, okay? So at a click of a button, I was able to enable Captivate websites, and what Captivate has done has created this website for me using that information that I've already given it. So what I'd recommend doing is make sure that you have a host that offers websites as well, because then that's going to make the website side of things much easier for you. Keywords then. Keywords are so important. Now, I feel like each of my things I'm going to say, they're so important because they are. So keywords, what are keywords? So basically, keywords are what people are typing into Google to find you, okay? So the words, the queries, the keywords, right? What is it that they're searching for that you should come up, your podcast should come up for? So here's an example. So I've got my keyword research tool here, and I've searched for SEO podcast, and it's come back with SEO podcast and best SEO podcast, and combined on average it gets about 800 searches a month. Okay, so great keyword. I then have a look in Google, and again I've got that screenshot of the desktop, but I've just zoomed in on the top 3 in that grid. So you remember the grid that I showed you earlier? Hopefully you'll be able to see something with all like the 3 podcasts that are on the top 3 positions, right? They all include the words SEO and podcast. So this goes to show how important it is to get a keyword in the main show title, okay, in your main podcast show title. Now, if you don't really know where to start with this, okay, you have no idea where do I even start with keywords? I'd like to introduce you all to Google Podcast Manager. So earlier I already said that Google has their own podcast app, Google Podcasts. So all you need to do is Google Podcast Manager, sign up as an account, and then claim your show. And then what that enables you to do is manage your show within Google Podcasts, okay? It not only allows you to do this, but because it's Google, you get awesome keyword data, right? you get to see the actual terms and keywords that people have typed into Google, and Google has deemed as relevant and has shown you, okay, has shown you and your podcast, right? That's a great way to start, because you can have a look at these keywords and see if any of them are relevant. Can you work them into your show title? Now, next, an additional step to Google Podcast Manager. So you need a tool that gives you an average monthly search volume. So there are tools out there that can like say on average how many searches a particular keyword gets. Podcast Manager doesn't give you this. It gives you impressions and it gives clicks, but you don't get that additional bit of data. So what I would recommend doing is getting yourself a keyword research tool. There's loads out there. Just have a Google of the best keyword research tools. Some are free, some you have to pay for. Generally speaking, the more expensive, the more fancy. I don't know why I did this, fancy. That obviously means fancy. But yeah, at the beginning, you don't really need that much. All you need it to do the basics. What all keyword research tools do is you need to be able to input a keyword or a topic, and it comes back with average monthly searches, okay? So once you have got that and you've sifted through the keywords and you're like, okay, this one makes the most sense, it gets a lot of searches, I'm going to incorporate this into your title, you're done, right? You can also get synonyms, can never say that word. So queries that are closely related into your show description. Now, please, please, please do not keyword stuff, right? So make sure that it makes sense. Don't just get a keyword in there for the sake of it, because people are going to read it, and keyword stuff in like getting as many keywords into your show notes doesn't work. It used to like 10, 20 years ago, but Google's much more sophisticated nowadays, okay? So try and get some keywords and synonyms in, but only if it makes sense and it sounds like, yeah, authentic, and because people are going to read that. You also want to be getting keywords into your episode title and the show notes, okay? So arguably, and this is what I do, is when I am planning my podcasts, so my future podcast episodes, I use a keyword research tool to find out what is it that actual people search. So yeah, and it's great because not only does it help you with topics, but you can see exactly what people are searching for, and you can get that actual keyword. So yeah, you can do your research, get that keyword and put it into your episode title and your show notes. So keywords, very, very important. Backlinks. So backlinks are external links from websites that point to your podcast website. Now, backlinks are always going to be bread and butter to Google. So when Google are looking at pages and deciding what to show people for different search queries, they have a checklist. Now, another bit of lingo is the fancy word for that is an algorithm. They have an algorithm that works out what is the best page to show. But basically what an algorithm is a checklist. So Google has a look and yeah, checks it out and has this checklist in mind to help it understand what pages or what content should be shown for a certain keyword that someone types in. Now, backlinks are important because Google sees a backlink as a vote, right? So obviously Google needs help in knowing what website pages, podcast websites it can trust, okay? So obviously there's lots of factors that come into trust, but backlinks can help, because if you've got a backlink from another website and that's a decent website, it's not spammy, it's highly authoritative, it's relevant, right? If you've got a link, Google sees that as a vote, like, this is a good website. So we need to be having a think about how we can create backlinks for your podcast website. And I'm going to share a couple of ways we can do that. Now, if you've been thinking about appearing on other people's podcasts, maybe this is the final push, like another reason. There's loads of good reasons, but it helps with SEO, right? So I appeared on the Search with Candor podcast. They have a podcast website, and individual episodes have pages. And when my episode went live, you see there how it's got what's in this episode. And if you look at where my arrow is pointing, you'll see SEO Mindset podcast, and that links to my website. So that is a vote to me, to Google. That is a backlink, and that's going to stay there, right? Like, that's going to stay there for as long as that episode is live. So hopefully Jack won't decide to delete the episode, or the episode won't be taken down, but that backlink will be live for as long as that episode is. Switching that around then, maybe you've been toying with the idea of getting guests onto your show instead. So this is another final push. Like, this is another great reason why, because it helps with your SEO. So we had someone from Reflect Digital come onto the podcast, and once that episode was live, I let them know, but then I was like, here are the links, here's the code to embed the web player. It'd be great if you could put a blog or a page together, and link out to our podcast website. And they did it, right? So they've put this this page together that talks about the podcast and who was a guest. And you see, it explores the importance of people skills and building relationships as part of a career in SEO. That's a link to my website. Awesome, right? So again, that's going to stay there for as long as that page is there, and as long as that episode is live, I don't think they're going to take that down. So that's another great way that you can get backlinks. My final suggestion, and I'm going to give you some more lingo. I tell you what, you're going to be an SEO pro, I tell you. But yeah, so I'd like to introduce you to the world of listicles. It's a bit of a silly name. Well, I think it's a bit of a silly name. But anyway, so have a go. So go to Google and type in best topic podcasts. So that topic should be the topic that your podcast falls into. So I did SEO because obviously I have an SEO podcast. So when I search for best SEO podcasts, Google gives me all of these listicles, okay? And listicles are articles that review X of the best service or business or product, right? So in this situation, it is your podcast. So as we can see here, Ahrefs have put together 15 podcasts to boost your SEO game. Search Engine Journal, top 17 SEO podcasts for 2022. So we've got loads on here. What I want to be doing is checking these listicles out and making sure that my podcast is mentioned, that my podcast is on there, because yes, I get some brand awareness and I get some free advertising, but I get that backlink as well. I get Ahrefs, I get Search Engine Journal to send people to my podcast website. So do this for your podcast, and you never know, you might get the timing really, really right. So Search Engine Journal, they need to update that, because you see how it's 2022, we're now in 2023. So you never know the author. So what you need to do is find out who has authored that article and reach out to them and say, hey, great article, just want to let you know about my podcast. This is why I think you should mention us. It'd be great if you could include us. Yeah, like, sell yourself, give yourself your XYZ statement, your sales pitch, right? But you see here, Search Engine Journal, they need to update that. That was 2022 and now it's 2023. So the author might be updating that article anyway. And I've timed it really right, because they were looking for new podcasts anyway. So I've helped them. I've done their job for them. So they might include us. And here's an example of where we did it for the SEO mindset. So this is one of those listicles that I was talking about. Luckily, with this one, I didn't have to reach out to the person because we were all already mentioned. But as you can see, we've got all that links, all those links, we've got the logo, we've got a description, and there's that backlink. So the SEO Mindset website, great for us. Obviously, if I came across this listicle and we weren't mentioned, I'd be looking for that author, reaching out to them and being like, hey, you should include us, and this is why. Internal links, right? So internal links are just as important as backlinks, and those who sort of either work in SEO or know about SEO sometimes neglect internal links because they focus on the backlinks when internal links are just as important. So internal links is when you have your own website page that links to another website page. So that's what an internal link is. So just want to introduce you to John Mueller. So John Mueller works for Google, and he's basically the go-between in between Google and those that work in SEO. So whenever Google does something and SEO people want to moan, they go to John Mueller. If they've got a question, they go to John Mueller. So yes, he's very well respected in the SEO industry. He was asked about internal linking and whether it was important or not, and he said yes, absolutely. It's something where internal linking is super critical for SEO. I think it's one of the biggest things that you can do on a website to kind of guide Google and guide visitors to the pages that you think are important. And what you think is important is totally up to you. So with internal linking, we need to be helping Google, helping users know what pages of our podcast website are important. So for example, so when we're thinking about internal linking, we need to first be thinking about the homepage, because obviously any links from the homepage to other pages, Google's going to be like, wow, they're linking from the homepage, it must be important. So maybe you can have your latest episodes somewhere on your homepage, and it links out to your new ones, right? And that's going to really help because your new episodes need time for Google to come across them, right? So if you're linking to them from your homepage, that's only going to help things. So that's one thing that you can do with internal linking. Another thing that you could do with internal linking is linking in between different episode pages. So for example, you might reference a previous episode because it's relevant to what you're talking about. So if you reference it, make sure that you include a link in your show notes, and your show notes are on your website, because then we've got another internal link. Another way that you could do an internal link is you could put together category pages, right? So you could have a look at all of your episodes and kind of put them into categories. And then you could create these categories, which literally has lists of all of those episodes that fall into that category. So yes, internal linking we need to be doing. We need to tell Google what pages are important. And there's lots of ways that we can do that. We just need to have a think. Transcripts then. So transcripts are the text version of your audio. Here is a transcript that we have on the SEO Mindset podcast. Now, these are important from an accessibility point of view, because unfortunately, not everyone can listen to audio. So we need to have them anyway. But Google can also use transcripts to help it understand what a podcast or a podcast episode page or a podcast is about, right? Because Google can't understand audio. I mean, there are arguments whether they can or whether that's going to be something in the future. But at the moment, I don't think they are. And I had a talk with John Mueller because I got to meet him at a conference, and he confirmed that at the moment they're not really doing that. So having a transcript, you're giving more text, more information, more context on that page so that Google can understand what that episode is about. So we need to get a transcript. We need to have a transcript as part of our process. And there's loads of tools out there. all you need to do is have a Google. I feel like that's all I'm saying. Have a Google for this, have a Google for that. But yeah, have a search online for best transcription tools, and you'll see loads out there. Some are free, some are paid for. The ones that I've seen for free, they limit stuff, so you can only transcribe like 2 hours or something like that. But yeah, we need to do them for accessibility, and we need to do them for SEO. YouTube then. So how many times have you Googled something and Google has shown you a YouTube video, or you must have seen it where there's a carousel of YouTube videos? It can be the same for podcasts, right? This is really smart. So for the term managing SEO clients, Google is showing this YouTube video. So a YouTube video that where the title is SEO Clients Management, Communication and Coordination. Now you'll see that this video is by Crawling Mondays by Aleda. Now Crawling Mondays is a podcast, right? So what Aleda's done here is really smart, because she has a podcast. But what she does is when she records the video and then she uploads that to YouTube. And it's working for her, right? We know that Google shows YouTube videos, YouTube carousels for certain terms, and it's working for her, right? Because people click on this video, they open it up in YouTube, they watch the video, but then in the description, Aleda can link out to her podcast, she can link out to people subscribing. So it just helps with that discoverability, okay? You're increasing the chance of people coming across you. And also, YouTube is a search engine in itself, because people go to YouTube and search. So again, you're increasing that visibility, you're increasing the ways that people can come across you and your show. So yeah, have a think about YouTube. Now I know there's always a debate whether you should just do audio podcasts or video podcasts as well, but maybe this could be something that that's in the for box, if you're toying with the idea. I'm just going to point out a tweet by my friend Maudie Oberstein. So Maudie works for Wix, which is a website content management system, and he hits the nail on the head and says podcast SEO is pretty wonky. Read on to find out why. Now he is awesome, because basically he put an article together and he basically reached out to a load of SEOs in the industry who have a podcast to give their advice about podcast SEO. So there's the link there at the bottom, bit.ly/Wix podcast SEO. Bit of a shameless plug, because those eager eyes, yes, the big thanks to some of you may have seen Sarah MCD UK. Yes, that is me. So if you want some more advice from me and some other awesome people within the industry who have podcasts, go and check that out. Now, I think we've got time for a bit of a Brucey bonus. So I'm going to quickly touch on increasing visibility in apps, because I'd like to argue that apps are search engines themselves, because people go to these apps to search for stuff, right? So they're a search engine. So I'm going to so now I'm just going to finish off by giving you some tips about what we can do in the apps. So first things first is podcast distribution. Okay, so if we want to be found by different apps and different directories, we need to make sure that we're pushing our podcasts out to all the relevant platforms. So here is the SEO mindset in Captivate, and here's distribution page. So here I can make sure that my podcast is distributed to all the major apps. And when Captivate introduced a new one to add, I can go in there and make sure that my podcast is approved and it's submitted and it can be found in there. So that's number one. Number two is Podchaser, right? So Podchaser is basically the IMDb. I always get the D and the B mixed up, but they are the IMDb of podcasts, and they have over 500,000 monthly active users. So if you haven't already, you need to create yourself a profile on Podchaser and claim your podcast. Now, these 500,000 monthly active users are going to Podchaser. So they're a directory and app in itself. Like they go, so these active users will go find their favorite podcasts, rate and review, check out other podcasts, right? So it's another awesome way of upping that discoverability of yours. And what's even more awesome is that if you have a profile, you can also comment on the reviews and what people are saying. So it's really awesome to be within this community on Podchaser, and that will really help you. So get yourself on Podchaser if you're not already. You could also ask for people to rate and review on individual podcast apps. So probably it does not make sense asking for people to do everything, because if you ask people to do everything, they won't do anything, right? So what you could do is go into your analytics. So this is analytics for the SEO mindset, and find out what your most popular apps are. So for me, that's Apple Podcasts. So I could focus on that, right? So yes, I'm going to do Podchaser, but I could also like test asking for people to rate and review on Apple Podcasts, because if you're getting more rates and reviews on Apple Podcasts, then Apple Podcasts are going to notice that, right? So yeah, you can up your game there and increase your increase your visibility that way. And lastly, what we need to be thinking about is how can we stand out? So when people are searching on those apps, how can I stand out? How can people be drawn to my podcast and not others, my competition, if you like to call it? So the way that we do that is with the artwork, okay? So do some research yourself. What I'd recommend you doing is opening up a podcast app, go to your category or your topic and just have a bit of a scroll and see what's drawing your eye in, see what's grabbing your attention, okay? And see if you can incorporate that into your artwork. Now, if you've already got artwork, you can always have a revamp, you can always have a refresh, right? And also what you need to consider is that sometimes your logo is going to appear really, really small. So you need to make sure that your artwork is clear. It's not too busy. The title's clear, the image is clear. People can see, even when it's really, really small, what your podcast is about. Right, so that is me done. Just going to I've not had any water. I've done a lot of talking. So podcast SEO then. If you haven't already, get yourself a website. Make sure you do your keyword research and find keywords to include in your main show title, your show description, your episode titles and your show notes. Get yourself some backlinks. So obviously use my suggestions, but also have a think of other ways that you can get backlinks as well. Focus on building internal links. So help Google understand what pages are important on your podcast website. How can you up those internal links? Use transcripts. We should be doing that from accessibility anyway, and it's going to help Google and SEO. So win-win on both fronts. And consider YouTube. I get that there's like this debate whether you should just stick with audio or do video as well, but if it helps with your discoverability, Google showing YouTube, then I don't know, have a go, test it, right? We've got to test things as podcasters, see what works. Thank you very much for listening. Yeah, I believe now it's time for question and answer. But on my slides, I have included my Twitter handle, so Sarah MCD UK, and also Captivate's Twitter handle as well. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. That was absolutely brilliant, and so many takeaways and actionable bits and bobs that we can get cracking with right now, basically, and nothing that's out of our realm either, and nothing that's going to cost us thousands and thousands of pounds, which I think a lot of podcasters worry about when we want to market our podcasts, is that we're going to have to fork out money to do it. So I've got some questions lined up from people who've been in the chat. First off, and they're not too grilling either, so don't worry about that. First off, we've got Caroline Vernon, who's about websites actually, and she's asking, do we need to have a website per podcast, or is it okay that you've got different pages on the same website about different podcasts?
I mean, that's a very good question. So obviously there's a couple of things to caveat here. The more websites that you've got, the more management that you've got to think about. Okay, the more marketing and the more of the upkeep. So to help you out, I don't think there's going to be any issue having the one website and then have sub pages, because in my example, Wix have a they have a page on their website for their podcast. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's absolutely fine to have pages on a website that are dedicated to that. Obviously, if you've got the time, budget, and resource, you're gonna have benefits of having separate websites, because then Google can understand, okay, that website is for this podcast, that website is for that podcast, and yeah, so it depends how much time and resource you've got, really. But I don't think, the main takeaway is have a website, have something that Google can surface, have something that Google can show, right? So yeah, hopefully that answers the question. I feel like, yeah.
No, it does, definitely. Will Google, in terms of crawling and whatnot, Google, when you put search into Google, do they prefer standalone websites, or is it okay to have a page on a larger website?
I don't think it's not that they prefer, do you know what I mean? Like, it's not that because you have a standalone website, they're going to pick you over one that doesn't. Like, as long as you're optimizing the individual pages, you're doing the internal linking, do you know what I mean? Like, as long as you're taking into consideration all the stuff that I've sort of said, you're not going to get penalized, or you're not going to yeah, it's not going to go against you. Yeah, it's all about what you can manage, what is in your resource, and yeah, and tackling it that way.
So having something on the World Wide Web, whatever it is, that Google can crawl is a Brucey bonus, as you say.
And I don't know where Bruce came from. It just came out my mouth.
And so I know that Anchor, when you upload your, and this is a question actually from Julianne Needham, when you have uploaded you Anchor as your host, they provide a page for you that's got your podcast on there. And so is that enough as a website?
Yeah, because Captivate do the same. So this is always an interesting one. So obviously, like, that is going to be enough, but you've just got to remember that if you have a website within your podcast host, you're not going to have as much options, or you can't tinker around with it as much as you can if you've got a standalone website. Okay, so that's always going to be the caveat. But having a website that your host generates, whether that's Anchor, whether that's Captivate, that's going to be fine. That's going to be fine, because my so for the SEO Mindset podcast, shameless plug, for the SEO Mindset podcast, I'm using a Captivate website, so that's what they've generated, and I'm being found for terms, and I'm being, do you know what I mean? Like, I'm coming up in search results. So again, it all comes down to how much money you've got, what resource you've got,
Mhm.
and maximizing that. And again, Google's not going to penalize you if you by having a website that's created by a host.
Yeah, I searched for one of my former clients' podcast yesterday, and I searched for their podcast in Google, and the first result that came up was their Captivate page.
Yeah. Well, and that's because so Google will always aim to show the most relevant page, the most relevant result for what that person has searched for. So in that sense, it makes sense to send people to that website, because that's where their podcast is hosted. That's where you can go and find out information. That's where you can go and find all their episodes and descriptions and stuff like that. So yeah, it's all relevancy to Google at the end of the day, and what makes the most sense.
Moving on to the changes we can make when we're uploading our podcasts. So Stephanie's got a question about keywords. You mentioned in the talk, is it enough to have your keywords in the title, or do you need to be having it in the show notes? And an addendum to that is, how does it matter how early on you have those keynotes in your show notes?
No. So when it comes to keywords, I'd definitely recommend having it in your podcast title and in your overall description as well, because you're helping Google understand and sort of link that keyword to your podcast. Massive caveat here is be careful of, and I said this in the talk, keyword stuffing. So that's where you're just trying to get keywords in there for the sake of getting keywords. If it sounds weird and it sounds like not authentic, then that's going to turn away actual people who are listening, right? And yes, we need to think of search engines and we need to think of Google, but we need to think about listeners first, okay? We need to think about those people, and Google wants us to do that as well, because they're always like so many algorithm updates, or they're always doing updates to how they rank stuff, and most of it is centered around the people who are reading or listening. Do you know what I mean? So we need to have those people in mind.
Yeah.
So just have that as a caveat. But I'd recommend having it in your title and having keywords and synonyms, so related keywords, so keywords that are similar, in your show description, and also make sure the individual episodes as well. So I made this point earlier. So I use a keyword research tool. I use keywords to help me plan my episodes, right? Because I know what it is people are typing into Google and they want answers for. So it's a no-brainer taking that and putting that in as the title. And also why, because you've done that and you've got that keyword or that topic in mind, when you're recording and doing your podcast, you're more likely to say it anyway. So then when you've got that transcript and you put that transcript on the episode page, again, Google's you're giving Google more context and more that this keyword is important, this do you know what I mean, if that makes sense?
Yeah Loads. You mentioned about keywords and keyword tools. Are there any keyword research companies' websites that you'd recommend?
There's loads, right? So if you want a budget, if you want a free one, Keywords Everywhere is a good one. Neil Patel's Ubersuggest, that's fairly cheap. It's something like $8 a month, £8 a month or something like that. And then the tools that I use are a bit more spenny. Spenny. Can I get away with saying that word? Spenny just came out. So SEMrush, so SEMrush and Ahrefs. Hang on. So SEMrush, put in the chat. No, I haven't. Why won't it let me? Okay, for some reason I can't message in the chat. But
I put SEMrush in.
SEMrush, and then Ahrefs is Ahref. They make it awkward. There we go, Ahrefs. So they're a bit more expensive. So they're more about like the $100 a month. But as I said in my talk, the more expensive a tool is, the more like whistles and like the more fancy and the more features you have. If we're just using it for keyword research, you really don't need to go to town. You don't need to be spending loads like Keywords Everywhere or Neil Patel's Uber Suggest. Have a Google of best free, because there's going to be loads out there, and there's going to be people are creating stuff all the time. All you need a tool to do is you need something where you can input a topic or a starting point or like an idea or a keyword, right? And it needs to spit out and the average monthly searches. Okay, so you don't need to go too fancy at this stage. Like, I'm fortunate because I work in SEO, I get to use something like Ahrefs and SEMrush, but that's because I need it to do more SEO stuffs, really. So don't worry too much.
And we're going to try and fit in 4 more questions. So Mark from Stories of Britain podcast asks, can you reasonably expect to get your website on page 1 using competitive and strong search terms?
Say that question again.
So Mark from Stories of Britain podcast says, can you reasonably expect to get your website onto page 1 for competitive strong search terms?
So can you get your website onto page 1 like for a strong keyword search term? Is that
yeah.
So this is a tricky one to answer, and something that SEOs always say is it depends. And that is because there is a lot of factors. Okay, so when Google is deciding what websites, what pages to show for certain queries, it takes in lots of different considerations. So I touched on it earlier, that they have an algorithm, and basically an algorithm is a fancy word for a checklist, right? So it's got all these things that it's looking at. So obviously, if you are a podcast and the search term includes podcast, it's reasonable to think that you're going to be shown for that. So on page 1, page 2, because it's relevant to Google. So for example, like if someone was to search for SEO podcast, for example, because I am an SEO podcast, it's reasonable for me to like go after that and optimize and go for that sort of search term. So it's all about relevancy. So when you're putting together your strategy and your keywords, is it relevant? Is it relevant to what you do? Is it relevant to your podcast? And maybe it's a query where they could show a podcast, or they could show a product, or they could show like an article. Do you know what I mean? So it all depends, really. And yeah, like I nearly got through a whole SEO talk without saying it depends, which is quite good for SEO folk out there. But hopefully that answers the question. So.
And what you said earlier in your talk is that as podcasters and it's your content, you can play around with stuff and see what works, can't you?
Exactly. And you should be like trying stuff out, like seeing if it works, see if it like increases your audience listens, or what I stress everyone to do is I talked earlier about Google Podcast Manager, right? There's so much great data in there, and it's all for free. Do you know what I mean? Like you don't have to pay for that. So that's awesome, because you can see what keywords, what people are actually typing in to Google, and Google has shown you, because one, Google thinks that you're relevant for that term and you're already being shown. So yeah, like use Google Podcast Manager because it's such a great resource.
So a couple more questions left. Most of us here have uploaded an audio file onto an automatic transcriber
Yes.
robot, AI, and some robot somewhere reads it and auto transcribes it. And we know that even if we speak the Queen's English, that no doubt it's going to get some words wrong. So Ben asks if you just upload it verbatim or you take the time to edit it.
So I would recommend, if you've got the time, to edit it, right? I mean, at the very least, skim through it and have a look, like skim through, and definitely take out filler words, so your ums, your likes, your ands, because you want to help Google. So when Google is looking at a page, when it's indexing or crawling a page, you want to make that easy for them. So if you can, like, I said, like, if I could cut out that filler word. So yeah, to help Google to really understand what that podcast episode is about, do that tidying up. Because yeah, like, having the ums and the likes might confuse Google, or it might take away from your main point, because Google's smart, but it's not a human at the end of the day. Do you know what I mean? It's a machine. So yeah, definitely. I know it takes time. I get it. There's so many times where I can only just skim through and tidy it up, but it does definitely help. And also, if you do tidy it up, you could repurpose it, right? You could repurpose it into a blog post. You could repurpose it into social media posts. So I'm always an advocate of, like, if you're doing the work for something, how can you stretch that and get the most out of it? So yeah, get the transcript, tidy it up, and then knock together a blog post. I say like it's easier, but
yeah. I think with all these things, to make your podcast stand out and to make a podcast, it all takes time. There's no quick fixes, are there?
Like, if you've only got, it all depends how much time you've got at the end of the day. If you haven't, if in your so when you're putting, when you've got your podcast process. So when I first started podcasting, I spent the most time in planning, recording, and editing, and then everything post-production, so getting it out there, promotion, I didn't spend that much time, because I spent all my time doing the recording and the editing. So I've looked at ways of speeding that bit up, that side, so then I have more time to do the promotion and this side, like your show notes, your transcription, because these are like the big things that are really, really going to help. So it all depends how much time you've got. If you've got 2 minutes to skim, do that. If you've got 5-10 minutes to spend longer, then do that. But yeah, definitely do that. And I think I did see a tool that automatically takes out filler words, to have a look at that.
Yeah, I know Descript does. You can
yeah,
or you could even just copy and paste your transcript to Word and do Control and find, and then find all the ums, and then
there you go. Yeah.
2 more questions left then, and then we're going to have a wee break and come back for some podcasting questions. Julie Needham, good to see you here, Julie. Question about YouTube.
Oh, if I put that, yeah.
How useful is that YouTube putting on there if you simply get your audio and with Headliner or something, put a static image up there with some captions?
Would that work?
Yeah, is it better than nothing? I suppose.
Better than nothing. I think that's the theme, right?
Yeah.
If that's what you can do it, because you should, like I showed you on the screen that it's working for Screaming Mondays, Aleda. So yeah, she's getting more discoverability because she's got her podcast on YouTube, right? And YouTube is a search engine in itself. Like, millions of people use YouTube. So if that's what you can do for now, do it. definitely do it. Something that I'm toying with is, because I know that some people will live stream, so you can use something like StreamYard, can't you? Or or you might not even need to use StreamYard if it's just you. But something that because I'm toying with the idea of YouTube, because I know it's going to be great for discoverability and I get it and it makes sense. I just need to understand how that works with my process. So something that I'm possibly going to do is, when I'm recording, do the video at the same time or stream it at the same time, and then like it's going to be raw and authentic and people are going to have to like it, right?
Great idea. Lovely idea.
Just have decent lighting, make sure you haven't got anything in your background that you shouldn't, I suppose.
And the final question from Caroline is about metadata.
Oh, yes.
Yes, getting down and geeky now with metadata. So when you have your MP3 file of your podcast that you're going to upload to your host, does filling in the metadata matter?
Helps, yes, because Google uses metadata to help it understand. So when we think about SEO, when we think about Google, and search engines, it's all about helping them understand what that podcast is about. Okay. Because the more that it can understand about that podcast, it's going to be better at showing that for a relevant search term. So when someone types something into Google and you're relevant to be shown, metadata definitely helps, because that is something that Google looks at. So Google will check out the metadata, so your page title, your meta description. So yeah, it definitely does help. So do that. And I think there's even talk, I don't know if this is a bit too techie, but those who are familiar with schema, there is talk in the industry about how that helps as well. So obviously schema is more data, more context, more information that you're giving to Google about your podcast and episodes. So those that are familiar, I was a bit nervous saying it because I don't want to scare people off, but yeah, schema is potentially something to look into as well.
Okay, well, we'll put that in chat as well. That is all of the questions. So my understanding, SEO in my head is that you've got something you want to promote, and so I imagine that you put lots of Velcro sticky bits on it, and what Google does is it casts like a Spider-Man web with the other sticky bits of Velcro on it, and you've got to make sure that your sticky bits of Velcro are in the right place.
Love that. Can I use that? Can I?
Yeah, of course you can. Yeah.
I'll make sure I mention you and be like.
Thank you. This has been absolutely really helpful. And like I said before, lots of bits and pieces for people to take away and action straight away. So a massive thank you to Sarah McDowell from Captivate for telling us the ins and outs of podcast SEO. A round of applause there, I think, for Sarah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining.